with him. I took notes from that and had a great one. So thank you for the booking tip.
That's great. You know, the book is sold out,
Yes.
The Breakup by Kurt Anderson. And so we will alert you out there as soon as the book is back in print. The first printing completely sold out, thanks to what your coverage, I think it was your coverage Friday night, Ali, that just sold out the book at that point.
Between the two of us, it's a good read. So thank you, my friend. You have yourself a great night.
Thank you.
The 11th hour starts now. Tonight, Donald Trump just won a partial victory in his bid to turn the U.S. Postal Service into a political weapon against voters. We'll dive into what it means for the midterms and beyond. Plus, the data center backlash is coming for Republicans. We'll head to one red state where it might be too late for the GOP to backtrack before the midterms. And what started as a bit of Trumpian bluster is now a full-scale trade war, complete with counter threats, name-calling, expletives, and tens of billions of dollars, your dollars, hanging in the balance. What it means for your bottom line ahead. Imagine it's November 1864 in Petersburg, Virginia. 60,000 men have already died in the trenches there. Private Thomas Halligan is one of the soldiers still standing. He's 500 miles from his home in Lansingburg, New York. He can't leave the line to vote, so he signs a ballot with a shaky X. He has it witnessed, and he puts it in the mail. Halligan was one of over 40,000 Union soldiers who voted that way that year, by mail, from the front. Lincoln himself, who won that election, said it plainly: we cannot have free government without elections. In the middle of a war that was killing hundreds of men a day, the United States trusted the mail to carry its democracy forward. That trust is the oldest continuous thread in this country's electoral history. It's older than the telephone, it's older than income tax, it's older than half the states in the Union today. Here's the twist. The Postal Service's own motto, the one about snow and rain and gloom of night, isn't even American. It's Herodotus, writing 2,500 years ago about Persian couriers. An architect liked the phrase, so they carved it into the James A. Farley Post Office at 34th and 8th in New York City in 1914. USPS built more than a century of trust on a borrowed line about reliability. And now that trust and that reliability are being weaponized. On Friday night, the U.S. Postal Service issued a 95-page final rule on mail ballots. It requires states to upload voter and ballot data into a new federal system before USPS will deliver a single one. If a state fails to comply, ballots will simply not be delivered. That's the rule. It comes out of an executive order that President Trump signed in March, directing the Department of Homeland Security to build lists of who's allowed to vote by mail. States have fought it for months. Under the Constitution, states run their own elections, and buried in this new rule, the U.S. Postal Service defends the new power by comparing your ballot to cremated remains and replica explosives. Quote, although ballot mail does not present precisely the same operational issues as cremated remains or replica explosives, it's unquestionably sensitive mail that raises unique operational considerations, end quote. Cremated remains and replica explosives get special handling under postal law because they're classified as sensitive matter. USPS is now arguing that your vote belongs in that category, too. Two federal court injunctions have been blocking the rule. Both of them come from the judge Indira Talwani in Massachusetts, but in separate lawsuits. One brought by 23 states and the District of Columbia, and a separate one brought by the League of Women Voters. Across the two cases, Judge Talwani has ruled that the Trump administration has no constitutional authority to dictate how states run their elections. But the administration has appealed to the Supreme Court, asking for both injunctions to be lifted. And today, the Supreme Court issued an order per curiam, meaning it is an unsigned order, lifting one of those injunctions, the one from the state's lawsuit, which had blocked the entire executive order, including the new post office rules. The other injunction from the narrower League of Women Voters lawsuit, which specifically targets just the U.S. Postal Service rule within Donald Trump's larger executive order, is still in place. So whether Trump can now run full speed toward implementation is unclear. Plus, the Supreme Court did not rule today on the legality of the order itself. It just ruled against the argument from 23 states and D.C. that the changes to the election system caused their states harm. The majority of the Supreme Court today found that, quote, the order itself does not harm the states, so the district court lacked the jurisdiction to bar the government from trying to implement it. The reasoning from the Supreme Court is that the states suing the administration have not been harmed yet. Quote, Section 3 orders the Postal Service to initiate the process of proposing a rule that might bind the states in the future. It is not a proposed rule, let alone a final rule. If the Postal Service's final rule harms the states, they may challenge that rule, end quote. That's what the Supreme Court wrote today. But remember what I just said to you like 3 minutes ago when the show started? That the USPS announced on Friday a final rule. I don't know how the court got that wrong, because we all knew that that was the case. But military and overseas voters from North Carolina are going to be sent the first ballots of this general election on September 4th, 11 days from now. Voters are as close as possible to being harmed by this rule. As Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote in her dissent, this process, quote, needlessly injects chaos and uncertainty into the upcoming midterm elections. The court has held for a while now that even valid election-related claims can come too late. Today's revelation is that such claims can also come too early. Never mind that an election is looming and related harms are presently occurring, end quote. Now, whether the post office could implement such a rule less than 2 weeks from the first mail-in ballots being sent out is another question entirely. USPS admits that it cannot legally implement this for the midterms unless a court clears the way. And I said there is that extra stay that's still there. We don't know whether the Supreme Court will deal with this tomorrow or at all. But the USPS did issue the final rule on Friday anyway, attempting to become the largest, bluntest tool for voter suppression in this country. 161 years after Thomas Halligan signed his ballot with an X in the trenches of Petersburg, Virginia, the mail still carries American democracy. The only question now is which way. Joining me now is the former United States Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, Joyce Vance. She is an MSNOW legal analyst. Joyce, thank you so much for being with us tonight. This is a complex issue that I have to say I think people weren't necessarily paying full attention to until all of a sudden this final rule pops up for the Postal Service that upends the way people in many states think about voting. There are some states in this country where the majority of voting is done by mail.
Right, that's correct. And I think the reality here is folks who are paying attention understood that this rule was coming. They understood it would be timed to be close enough in time to the upcoming elections that it would be difficult to challenge it in court. And that's exactly how this has played out. What's remarkable about the Supreme Court's decision today is that they seem to ignore that this rule is supposed to be promulgated on Wednesday. And so I expect we'll hear more on that as the week gets further on.
So this is it's a legal question here because the Supreme Court's decision says this executive order would not cause irreparable harm to the states because it simply instructs the post office to consider making the rule. As you said, the Supreme Court, the post office made that rule and issued it on Friday. Am I missing something here? I mean, I assume the court has better information than I have.
No, you're missing nothing at all. In fact, all along in all of the courts that have looked at this executive order, the big issue has been what lawyers call ripeness. The argument has been this isn't ripe for a court to decide because the Postal Service hasn't promulgated rules. Well, now the government has undercut the best argument it had on its side. You know, this is why judges like Judge Talwani in Boston were only considering the legality of the order as to the 2026 election, because that was all that it was ripe for, and they were holding in abeyance 2028 and later elections. Now everything is on the table, but maybe the Supreme Court isn't seeing it the same way that we are.
I want to ask you about something else that the majority wrote on the court. It says the government, meaning the U.S. the federal government, the government is likely to suffer irreparable harm without a stay. The district court's breach of Article 3 interferes with the internal operations of the executive branch because reversal of the district court's judgment would come too late for the 2026 midterms. The district court's error deals a serious setback to the executive's goals while this litigation unfolds. I have to say that's above my pay grade as a guy whose only law, as you know, comes from Law and Order. What does that mean?
Well, look, this is one of the elements that someone who wants to get an injunction has to prove, irreparable injury. And this is a little bit of a screwball situation. The judge gave the plaintiffs an injunction. Now the government wants an injunction that will end that injunction. So the government has to prove these same factors, that it's likely to succeed on the merits. That's the whole ripeness argument. Then they have to prove that they're being irreparably injured as long as the initial injunction stays in place. And the government's argument here is that, in essence, because Donald Trump is the president and has the power to take certain steps, that they're being irreparably injured when the judge's injunction is in place. And look, there are two parties here. And on one side are voters arguing that they're being irreparably injured if we let this administration drop lists of who can and who can't vote. In many ways, this administration has been the gang that can't shoot straight when it comes to elections. You know, we hear stories about people who aren't citizens voting, but then when states like Nevada ask the government to prove that up, the government sort of is a dry well and can't come up with names.
Yeah, they said there were 16,000 people who voted illegally, and I was talking to the Secretary of State there who said they were able to come up with, I think, 17 or something like that.
That's right, and they can't put names to it. So these are the people that want us to trust them with creating these mail-in lists of who can and can't vote. It's just crazy sauce this close to an election.
I'm so deeply appreciative of you. Thank you so much, Joyce. It's always great to see you. MSNOW legal analyst Joyce Vance. All right, coming up, we're going to touch down in one red state where Republicans are trying to outrun their own record on data centers, and they do not appear to be succeeding. Plus, what may be the most consequential deal for the American economy. Joining me now is Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes. Arizona is one of the 23 states and the District of Columbia that filed a lawsuit that was stayed by the Supreme Court today. Secretary Fontes, good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me back, Ellie.
How are you and your fellow Secretaries of State and Attorneys General interpreting this order from the court? It's a little tricky because it reads that it's dependent on the U.S. Postal Service not issuing a final order, but they issued the final order on Friday. It's going to be promulgated on Wednesday. So the crux of their stay is based on something that is very shaky.
Well, it's a combination of weirdness. First, that point that you made, it talks about a possible order, and yet they issued the order on Friday.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things about the rule, I should say not the order, the rule that the Postal Service issued on Friday was that it indicated that as long as there is an injunction in one of the two critical cases, and this California case was one of them, that the rule would not go into effect. Well, the League of Women Voters case does have an injunction on it, which is the second case, we'll just call it for now. Except that the Postal Service today filed a motion to reconsider that injunction. That comes after a Saturday filing by the plaintiffs to enforce the injunction, because the injunction was pending a rule. Once the rule issued, then they weren't actually supposed to do that under the district court's order. So this is a really convoluted legal puzzle. You've got a couple of different cases. You've got a court that appears to not be paying attention to what's happening day in and day out as they issue these rulings. And I can't help but sympathize with people that are wondering about who in the world is running the Supreme Court right now. It's like they're just not paying attention.
It is a distinct and separate issue that I'd like to cover this week, because I think people have to understand this. But there are two immediate issues facing us. One is the fundamental opposition that you and other states had to exchanging information with the government. I want to talk about that in a second. But now there is this slightly more immediate issue, and that is the confusion around this, because the rule is going to be promulgated on Wednesday. There's still an outstanding injunction, and September 4th is the first day that ballots start to get mailed out to folks who are registered in North Carolina. So we're 11 days away from this. That's a lot of stuff to organize. How do you think about this moving forward?
Well, look, the concerns in North Carolina are national concerns, because those UOCAVA ballots have to go out by law 45 days prior to the election date. We're on top of that date right now, or at least getting close enough to it in some of the states. Here's the thing, just like with other folks, I was getting calls and emails from local county election officials in my own state. This is the biggest problem with this willy-nilly, shoot butt from the hip sort of policy making that's coming out of the White House with these ridiculous executive orders that flatly violate the Constitution. Look, it's real clear in Article 1, Section 4. The time, place, and manner of elections are set up by the legislatures of the state. That means by state law. And the Congress can get into it and make some rules. but it leaves out the executive. I don't think the president has the legal capacity to issue these executive orders. And so now that the rule has been promulgated by the Postal Service under this executive order, perhaps the Supreme Court will come back and say that you can't do that because it pertains to elections. They haven't adjudicated the underlying facts,
Yes.
As I just indicated. So that's, look, uncertainty is the worst thing in the world for democracy. It's the worst thing in the world for business. And I'll tell you what, if I was an investor, I'd be thinking twice about investing in this country. Not that I'm down on the United States, but the current government gives me no confidence in stability or the capacity to lead in a way that would make me comfortable if I was bringing my money in from other places.
Help me answer this question. What is the USPS is demanding in exchange people's ballot information from states. Now, some voter information is available to the public, in Arizona, for instance. So what's the difference between what's already public information and what the federal government is seeking from states in order to allow mail balloting?
So there's two buckets, as you indicated. One of them is the public bucket, and that is the sort of, we'll call it the transparency and accountability bucket. That's name, political affiliation, address, just a couple of basic identifiers so that you can see that this person is a registered voter and they got a ballot and whether or not they voted their ballot. That's how political parties keep track, candidates keep track so they can chase ballots during campaigns. Public information folks like you in the media can look at the raw numbers that way, and that's an accountability feature. Every voter also has a private section of the file so that we as elections officials can identify that, yes, this person is the actual person. That could include mom's maiden name, part or all of the social security number, tribal ID numbers, date and month of birth, and a whole bunch of other bits of private identifying information that we in Arizona are charged by law to keep private. And that was also the subject of the prior litigation that we've been winning across the country against this Department of Justice. So what we have here is really this odd situation where we're defending the law against the federal government and the executive branch. We're defending our voters and their privacy against this federal overreach that just seems so misguided and bizarre. I just don't understand it.
Well, that's what worries me, because you understand these things better than most people in the country. So that I thought I was just the one who was a little bit thick here, and I couldn't get my head around.
We're going to have an election. It's going to go well. Come hell or high water, as I said before. I have confidence in election administrators. Nothing out of this White House is going to stop us. We ran elections through civil wars and pandemics, floods, fires, and earthquakes. This is the grit of America represented in our elections officials.
Adrian Fontes, thanks for joining us tonight. Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes. All right, coming up, President Trump, the self-proclaimed deal maker in chief, has failed yet again to make a deal, and this latest failure may have the most long-lasting consequences of them all. And later, they say everything's bigger in Texas, and that includes the growing backlash and resistance to data centers. Severe storm struck the area back on August the 11th. At least 7 people were killed in the storms. Homes were destroyed. Businesses and schools remain closed. Gas pumps have run dry, and lines for food and other humanitarian assistance continue to be long. At one point, nearly 365,000 customers were without power in the heat of summer heat. Many only started getting power back in the last couple of days, but not in the town of Gary, Indiana, where the pain is being felt especially hard. About 1/3 of the residents of Gary live in poverty. Nearly 80% of the town is black, and that's led to criticism from civil rights leaders and advocacy groups and politicians. As local councilman Miles Tolliver says, quote, "My people are being overlooked." Joining me now is MSNOW reporter Nnamdi Egwuonwu in Gary. Nnamdi, tell me about the story.
Well, there essentially was a very intense storm in Indiana back on August 11th. It devastated much of northwest Indiana, but the worst of that storm, worst of its impacts, are felt in Gary. For context, Gary saw winds reach as high as 99 miles per hour. That's the equivalent of a Category 2 hurricane. And that was followed by days of heavy rainfall that led to flooding concerns. So ultimately what's happened is while that entire region was devastated, Gary saw the brunt of that damage. And that's what the utility provider in Indiana, NIPSCO, is saying is the reason why Gary is among the last towns in Indiana to see its power restored. It's really twofold. They say because of the extent of the damage in Gary, it just was worse there than other portions of the state. And two, it's been harder for crews to get get to certain communities, clear roads, remove down trees. Remember, you have to clear all of that out before you can even get to the job of restoring the actual power line. So that is what the utility provider is saying is leading to the delay. Now, on the other side of that, though, I point out that you have Governor Mike Braun, you have the Democratic mayor of Gary, you have residents that are saying that's not an excuse. These utility providers had 2 weeks now, roughly, to restore power. Competing utilities like ComEd restored power to their customers. It just seems like, at least according to the governor, NIPSCO is dropping the ball. Now, that company has said, hey, they are smaller than their competitors. They're working around the clock, but that's falling on deaf ears when you speak to residents in Gary, as I've done today, who have told me that they've thrown out their food and are wasting that money, who have told me that they are stressed that they are not able to go to work because they have to stay home with their kids because schools were closed, who tell me, I spoke to one person who said that they have insulin, things, actual medication that need to be refrigerated that they essentially had to risk expiring or just tossing out because of the lack of power. So roughly 2 weeks in, as you can imagine, residents are angry, they're frustrated. Now, just point out this, many have told me they were already dealing with higher utility rates from NIPSCO. Some have already gotten bills for next month, despite the fact that they currently don't have power. So as you can imagine, not only are they deeply frustrated, there is also a degree of economic uncertainty that many in that community are facing right now.
Nnamdi, thanks as always for your great reporting on this. MS Now reporter Nnamdi Egwonwu. All right, coming up, President Trump's trade war with Canada will have a measurable impact on the economy, but it's the impacts you can't measure that are going to do the long-lasting damage. As you first heard here on the 11th hour on Friday, intensive trade talks between the United States and Canada collapsed late last week. Both sides blame each other for the impasse. As a result, Donald Trump imposed 50% tariffs on $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, including plywood, beer, and dairy. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney responded by promising to retaliate dollar for dollar, adding that his country was attacked and is now, quote, at war with the United States. Trump is now threatening to go further, vowing new tariffs on cars, trucks, auto parts, and steel. As the Wall Street Journal's editorial board writes, quote, President Trump took exception last year when we called his tariffs against Canada and Mexico the dumbest trade war in history. It got dumber this weekend. In addition to a host of economic demands, Prime Minister Carney says American negotiators also tried to prevent Canada from forging trade deals with other nations and restrict protections for Canadian culture, notably Quebec's French language laws. And that was a red line for Carney, who said Canada is, quote, not prepared to compromise on our sovereignty, the protection of the French language, and our culture. The United States Trade Representative called that a fake story. The Toronto Star writes that Carney saw Trump's move as a, quote, attack on Canadian sovereignty and attempted psychological annexation that could have turned Canada into an American client state, a sort of North American Belarus, end quote. This entire ordeal has infuriated Canadians across the political spectrum. Doug Ford, the conservative story. The Toronto Star writes that Carney saw Trump's move as a, quote, attack on Canadian sovereignty and attempted psychological annexation that could have turned Canada into an American client state, a sort of North American Belarus, end quote. This entire ordeal has infuriated Canadians across the political spectrum. Doug Ford, the conservative premier of Ontario, Canada's most populous province, says Trump is a dictator and a bully and a loser who can, quote, kiss my ass. Trump responded in kind, calling the Prime Minister Governor Carney, a reference to Canada being made the 51st state, and calling Doug Ford his flunky, adding, quote, someone should get these clowns to fall in line, end quote. When asked about this by a reporter this afternoon, Doug Ford again referred to his posterity.
Did the Prime Minister tell you to ask you to tone it down a bit?
No, he didn't. I'm going to comment, but he wasn't against that. And I have a lot of real estate on my ass, so he has a lot of room to kiss my ass. So I just did. I'm a big dude. What can I say?
The consequences of Trump turning America into an unreliable trade partner are already evident. Canada has been expanding its economic ties with other countries, including a major new deal with China, in which Canada imports Chinese electric vehicles and China imports more Canadian agricultural goods. In addition, Canada has accelerated plans to export a significant amount more crude oil to China. Joining me now is Justin Wolfers, professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan and the host of Platypus Economics. Justin, something you know, but many Americans may not know, is that Mark Carney is a liberal, and Doug Ford is a conservative. And I mean, obviously in Canada, the spectrum is a little narrower, but these guys are on opposite sides of the political spectrum. This trade war with Canada has united Canadians in not a great way regarding America.
Absolutely. I actually think there's something really quite important for those of us on this side of the border to understand, which is, to the Canadians, this is not a trade war. Look, the trade wars, tariffs, friends can figure stuff like that out. The real turning point in this relationship came when Trump started joking about making Canada the 51st state, made it clear that he didn't care about their consent, and actually said that he would use the United States' economic power to force it into submission. Look, I don't know what was in the president's heart at the time. Presumably this is some sort of a joke, but it turns out that when you tell another country you want to take over, whether they like it or not, they just don't take it well. And that, I think, so for the Canadians, this is an existential threat.
Yes.
For the United States, this is a trade war.
Right.
And you need to, that fundamentally changes everything. And I just want to point one more thing out. This was so dumb. Your job as a politician is to make it easy for the other side to say yes.
Yeah.
The president's online trolling has made it impossible for the Canadians to say yes. He's hurt you and I and all of the viewers in order to be really good at social media. Yeah.
So tell me what the bigger problem is here, because this is $20 billion, so it's about 5% of trade with Canada, although it's $20 billion. That's real money. And by the way, if Canada retaliates, then they say dollar for dollar, so you double the impact that this has. But is it that? Because that's technically fixable. As you said, friends can work out trade issues. Or is it this long-lasting effect? Canada sells more than two-thirds of its goods to the United States, and it's just learning that it needs more trade partners. It needs to diversify its market.
Right. And so this is, I think you're exactly right. And so this is where the background is really fundamentally important, which is the United States has a free trade agreement with Canada.
Yes.
It was initially put forward by President Clinton. It was called NAFTA. The first President Trump came to power and he just ripped it up. He said, I don't like it. Turns out he's not very good at doing his homework, so he taped it back together and then just gave it a new name, which was the USMCA. I always like to think it rhymes with YMCA, the song. It makes me think about the Village People. That makes me happy. But it was basically relabeled NAFTA. And then the second President Trump came to power and said, what idiot negotiated this agreement? And he ripped it up again. Yeah. Now, what you learn at this point is signing a deal with this bloke doesn't buy you anything. Yeah. And if that's the case, then Carney and the Canadians would be fools to give anything up, because the president has already shown that on a whim, he will choose not to deliver his end of the deal.
What's the Canada benefits from the fact that it's got this partner to the south that it can sell all its stuff to, but it's got a lot of stuff. It can sell it to other countries too. What happens to America? Because this abstraction that Trump carries on about these are costs that are paid for by the other country. When you put 50% tariffs on $20 billion worth of things that are imported, that's some big portion of that, if not 100%, is going to hit the consumer who's buying the end product.
Right. So right there, we can do the math. You're going to be paying a lot more for a relatively small number of your goods. You're going to live with that. Let me explain the deeper problem. I live in Michigan. Michigan's on the border. It's one of the great producers of automobiles in the world. And the way that works is we combine American expertise with Canadian expertise, which is there's one auto industry that's basically all around that border right there. Yep. The Americans have the assembly factories. The car door, though, might come from Canada. Now, if you're a Canadian auto parts manufacturer, locating right on that border and really throwing your lot in with General Motors and Ford in the future of Detroit made a lot of sense when Clinton negotiated NAFTA. But now the president he literally spent more of today declaring a trade war against Canada than against Iran, despite the fact today was D-Day. But so now if you're a Canadian auto parts manufacturer, you no longer want to throw your lot in with Detroit because you no longer feel confident that that's going to be an ongoing, valuable, lasting relationship. You might build your next factory instead next to the port so that you can do business with Europe. That's the deeper and longer lasting thing. And that's going to hurt, yes, both the Canadian firm, but also it's going to mean that Detroit loses preeminence as an auto manufacturer. Yep. And this isn't just a story about cars, it's a story about cooperation.
Anything you talk about, it can be the same thing. The ports will relocate to the coasts where one side can go to Asia and one side can go to Europe. And you know, eventually everybody will learn to live with it, but the effects are longer lasting than the tariff percentage on goods. Justin, as always, you make things so much clearer for us. We always appreciate you. Justin Wolfers, Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of Michigan. All right, coming up, the Democrats, hoping to turn the Texas governor's mansion blue, is tapping into the state's bipartisan backlash over data centers, encouraging Republican voters to break rank and support her. And there's reason to believe she's succeeding. As job creators that would bring in new businesses and investments that would spark an economic revitalization in communities across the country. Instead, many Americans are feeling like they're being left behind by politicians who would rather cater to big tech's needs than their own. And as the artificial intelligence boom accelerates, the growing backlash to data centers has become too big to ignore. It can upend politics in a big way, even in a state like Texas. The state's Republican governor, Greg Abbott, has long courted tech companies to build AI data centers in his state. Last year, after Google said it would invest $40 billion in data centers in Texas, Abbott said that Texas was, quote, the epicenter of AI development. He added that the investment would, quote, support energy efficiency and workforce development. During his tenure, the construction of data centers in Texas has exploded. According to the Texas Tribune, there are 335 data centers operating in Texas today, and at least 248 additional data center projects in various stages of development across the state. Within the next 4 years, Texas is set to overtake Virginia as America's main data center hub if development continues at this pace. But that's a big if, because individual communities across the state have started resisting tech companies in a big way. Under Governor Abbott's watch, the state has given huge tax breaks to tech companies. According to the Texas Comptroller's Office, the state will lose out on $3.2 billion in sales tax revenue in just the next 2 years due to exemptions that are given to these companies. It's one of the costliest incentive programs that Texas has, and it's among the most expensive of its kind in the entire country. Now, arguably, tax incentives pay for themselves with the jobs that they create, except that Texas doesn't require tech companies to create that many jobs to qualify for these tax breaks. Companies that are building data centers larger than 100,000 square feet are required to create 20 jobs. For data centers larger than 250,000 square feet, it's 40 jobs. Tech companies argue that they bring in a lot of construction work, but building a large warehouse to store servers is very temporary work. And there are other concerns: the strain on the power grid, the pollution created by the need for more power, the enormous need for water. Put it all together, and many Texans, including many Texas Republicans, are concluding that it may not be worth it. And it's shaking things up ahead of November's elections. A Fox News poll of the Texas governor's race released late last month shows that Greg Abbott, the Republican incumbent seeking a fourth term in office, is ahead of his Democratic opponent, Gina Hinojosa, by only 1 point. Abbott has 50%, Hinojosa has 49%. It's within the poll's 3-point margin of error. But nonetheless, it's a stunning result for a state that Donald Trump won by 14 points in 2024, a state that has not elected a Democratic governor since 1990, nor a Democratic senator since 1988. Cook Political Report shifted the Texas Senate race recently from solid Republican to just likely Republican, yet another sign of Abbott's potential weakness. Some Texas Republicans have said that Hinojosa's call for a moratorium on data centers is a big reason why they're voting for a Democrat later this year, and the still growing backlash has forced Abbott to change his tune. Earlier this month, he ordered an audit of Texas's public utilities, which effectively paused the development of new data center projects. And in an interview yesterday, he shifted the blame directly onto the tech companies.
They pop up in places that nobody ever heard of before until they started the construction. And so they had not been working in collaboration with the state. They had not been working in collaboration with local governments. And so they basically dug their own grave for the problem that's been caused for them. And that's why they got the backlash they deserved.
Wow. Joining me now is Pat Garofalo, Director of State and Local Policy at the American Economic Liberties Project. Pat, welcome to the show. Thank you for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
In a Substack post earlier this summer, you didn't call for data centers to be banned because that might be verging on Ludditeness, but you did think we should ban subsidies for these data centers. Tell me, I'm going to actually read a little of what you wrote. You said data centers should be located where they provide tangible benefit to the community, not where they can engage in the most extraction, and eliminating the ability of the tech industry to claim tax handouts for building them is step one toward achieving that dynamic. Tell me more about this, because that seems to be the complaint a lot of people, one of the complaints people have, that you're giving them these tax benefits, they're not really creating jobs.
100%. It's one of the main complaints, and for a very, very good reason. I've been covering economic development issues going back to 2008, and honestly, that was the last time that I saw people as angry at an industry as they are now at data centers. Back then, it was the banks. Today, it's the tech firms that are building these data centers everywhere, and the tax subsidies are a big part of it. A data center is one of the absolute worst economic development tools that you can have in a community. It doesn't create jobs, as you said. It doesn't create any knock-on economic effects because the only thing that wants to be located next to a data center is another data center. They're noisy, whirring boxes that drive up your utility bills. And Texas is the perfect example of this. When the tax break was created for data centers in Texas, they estimated that this year it would cost about $130 million with an M. This year it's going to cost them more than $1 billion with a B. And as you said, about $3.3 billion over a 2-year budget window. That's really real money that can go into all sorts of projects that would actually help Texans, actually create jobs, actually help local businesses, and instead is being funneled to some of the most profitable companies in the history of the world.
So data centers are basically server rooms. They're server farms. They're just big ones because AI uses that much more computing power. So they've been around forever. We've seen server, but you don't interact with them. You don't really think about them much. Part of the issue here is the impact that they are having. The tax revenue lost, and as you said, energy. Texas has a power grid problem to start with. These companies draw off the power grid, costing more people energy, utility costs. And in some cases, when forced to make their own power, that's why you've got this whirring, and you've got they've got generators on site, and they've got power development, which then pollutes and causes noise. Is there a world in which these data centers work? Because they're probably bound to stick around. But how can this work?
Absolutely. I think there are a few key parts of any good agreement that a data center should have with the community. They should be paying their way for their own power. They should be rejecting any tax subsidies, and any tax subsidies on the books should be repealed. They should be required to get input from the local community. One of the most pernicious tactics that these data center developers use is that they have every elected official and economic development bureaucrat in the community sign a non-disclosure agreement. So they are quite literally contractually bound to not tell their constituents what is happening. You kind of heard Governor Abbott hint at that about data centers popping up with no one knowing. That's by design. Right. And then they should offer concrete benefits to the community. Are they building parks? Are they building bike lanes? Are they, sponsoring the local Little League team? Whatever the community wants, there's certainly ways for communities to get to yes, but the tech industry, in its arrogance and in its rush to build these things and push as many of them through the pipeline as fast as possible, has skipped over all of that.
So, I mean, there's all sorts of articles about this. Everybody's talking about how it's their uh-oh moment. There are lots of candidates and or governors who are saying, we're going to take a position on this. The federal government would like to not have governors be able to do anything to restrict AI and data centers. But what happens? Like, will there be a reversal? Are there going to be some states where they're going to put down rules and say, we're going to do it Pat's way, not your way?
I absolutely think so. You saw earlier this year in Arizona, they put a 3-year pause on their data center tax break at the behest of Governor Katie Hobbs in their budget. You saw Governor J.B. Pritzker in Illinois pause their data center tax breaks. Ohio did the same. Nebraska did the same. You saw Governor Kathy Hochul in New York after the legislature there passed a 1-year moratorium. She called for the same thing and did it via executive order. So you're starting to see the tide shift, and you're starting to see politicians get on the right side of this. But I do want to point out that voters have been there for a long time, and at the local level in communities all over this country, you've seen city councilors and mayors and kind of council aldermen lose their jobs because they were on the wrong side of the data center issue. So this is finally trickling its way up to federal actors.
Is there benefit to this being regulated on a federal level as opposed to with various states doing it?
I think that would be hard, mostly because of the tie-in with utilities. And I think that's a really important point here, is that there's a bit of collusion going on between the tech firms and the monopoly utilities. It's in the utilities' interest to have the largest projections about data center use and as much power as they're going to need, because the utilities can then recoup that from ratepayers, even if, and this is an important point, that stuff doesn't get used. So if in a world in which an AI bubble pops and we suddenly don't need all these data centers, we don't need all this power, the utilities are still going to be able to make bank and charge ratepayers for this. So I think it's a really important role for states and localities and state utility regulators to play in ensuring that that nightmare scenario doesn't happen.
If your scenario happens where they don't get the tax breaks, but they continue to build, can they still be profitable? Will AI still continue to carry on the path it's going? In other words, I sort of feel like these companies make so much money that the tax break they should be able to make this money with or without the tax break.
100%. There is absolutely no evidence that these tax breaks are necessary to make this a viable business venture. What we are essentially doing is, again, paying for the necessary business infrastructure of the most profitable corporations to have ever existed. And the research shows that those tax breaks often aren't even the determining factor about where something goes. There's supply chain issues, there's labor force issues, there's education issues, there's wanting to be in communities that are pleasant to live in and be in and have your workers in. So these tax breaks are not the deciding factor. They are quite simply big tech taking money that politicians have willingly been giving them.
Pat, thank you so much for this. This is a good lesson for us, and we're going to keep on having these conversations. We hope you'll stay up late and come join us again. Pat Garofalo is the Director of State and Local Policy at the American Economic Liberties Project. Tonight's 11th hour is done. Tomorrow starts right now.